The flight was uneventful and quiet. As passengers settled into their seats, everyone seemed calm as the cabin, filled with the usual murmurs of travel. The flight attendant made her rounds offering drinks and snacks when she noticed one man sitting alone by the window quietly staring outside. He hadn't spoken a word, not even a glance at her, his eyes fixed on the endless blue sky that stretched beyond the small plane window. Something about him struck her as peculiar, but it was subtle enough to be ignored at first. She moved past him to attend to the rest of the passengers, offering a friendly smile to the elderly couple in the row behind him. But the man by the window didn't respond at all, not a twitch of a muscle, not a shift in his posture. It was as if he wasn't even aware she existed. But there was something in the way he sat so still, something too controlled about it, that made her uncomfortable. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling he was different from the others. As the flight went on, she couldn't stop glancing over at him from time to time. His stillness intrigued her. She wondered what kind of person would choose to be so completely detached from everything around them. He seemed so calm, so unbothered by the chaos that usually surrounded air travel, the constant chatter, the rustling of papers, the clinking of trays. The only thing that moved was the occasional subtle shift of his fingers, tapping lightly against the armrest of his seat. It was almost imperceptible, but she noticed it each time she walked past. The rest of the flight was routine as passengers settled into their own worlds, reading books, watching movies, or chatting with their neighbors. But the man by the window never moved. He never even adjusted his seat back into the upright position for landing. He was simply there, silent and unmoving, like a figure carved from stone. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off about him, but it only grew stronger as the flight wore on. By the time the captain made the announcement that they were beginning their descent, she found herself still glancing at him, as if she was expecting him to suddenly spring into action or say something, but he never did. The flight attendant made one last pass down the aisle, checking to make sure everyone was ready for landing. She asked if anyone needed anything, but he remained silent, his eyes still fixed on the window, as if the world inside the plane didn't matter to him at all. She started to feel a sense of unease, something she couldn't quite place, but that instinctual feeling was growing louder as they neared the airport. She wondered if anyone had spoken to him at all during the flight. No one seemed to acknowledge his presence. Maybe he was just another lone traveler. She thought maybe he didn't want to talk to anyone, but that didn't explain why he made her feel like she was the one who was being watched. She was used to passengers not engaging. But this was different. There was a quiet intensity to him, something about the way he held himself that made her second-guess everything she knew about her job. As the plane continued its descent, the man finally shifted in his seat. Just slightly his hand moved off the armrest for the first time, and she felt the tiniest shiver of relief, like the tension that had been building around him had finally cracked. But the moment his hand lifted from the armrest, something felt wrong again. The air around him seemed to thicken, as if the atmosphere had changed. He wasn't just a quiet passenger anymore. She had the distinct feeling that he had been watching her every move, and she couldn't figure out why she suddenly felt exposed. The man was middle-aged and unremarkable at first glance, wearing a plain jacket and dark sunglasses. His demeanor was so calm that it almost seemed odd to her. No one else on the flight was so withdrawn. The flight attendant thought to herself that he must be one of those people who just didn't want to be bothered, but something about him kept her eye on him. His eyes were hidden behind those dark glasses, but she could still feel his gaze on her. She couldn't explain it, but every time she passed by his seat, there was an undeniable pull, as if something were drawing her attention to him. It wasn't until after the turbulence that she realized just how much her mind had fixated on him. She'd noticed every subtle movement, every slight adjustment of his body, every flicker of his fingers, every glance he made toward the window or the aisle, but still he hadn't spoken. Not once, not a word had passed his lips the entire flight. She went about her duties, trying to push the feeling of discomfort aside as she offered drinks and snacks to the other passengers, keeping busy with her usual routine. But all the while her mind kept drifting back to the silent man sitting alone by the window. He was always there, always watching, yet always still, as though the world inside the plane was of no interest to him. His behavior was unsettling, but she tried to push the thoughts away. It was just her overactive imagination. She thought everyone on flights acted a little strange, sometimes right. She should focus on the task at hand. But every time she glanced his way, something about him felt different, as if he wasn't just a regular passenger, but someone who was hiding something, or maybe even someone who was waiting for something. His stillness had an edge to it that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the kind of calm that put you at ease. It was the kind of calm that made you wonder what was brewing underneath it. His hands never moved beyond the slightest shift, and she couldn't remember ever seeing him take a drink or eat anything she'd offered him earlier in the flight. He had simply nodded and stared back out the window, never meeting her gaze. As she made her way down the aisle again, she caught sight of him. He hadn't moved since the last time. She saw him still staring out the window with that same unsettling calm. She tried not to stare back, but her eyes were drawn to him like a magnet. It wasn't just the silence that bothered her. It was the way he sat there, so completely detached from everyone else on the plane. It was as if he was in another world entirely, a world that didn't involve the mundane details of air travel or the small talk that usually filled the cabin. The only thing that seemed to matter to him was the vast expanse outside his window, and even that was like a distant memory to her. She went into the galley to prepare for the next round of service and tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her thoughts kept returning to the man by the window. She knew she had to stop thinking about him, but the feeling was impossible to shake. She thought about the way he had glanced at her when their eyes had briefly met earlier. There had been something in that gaze, something that made her feel like she wasn't just a flight attendant doing her job, but an object under scrutiny, like she was being watched. And the worst part was she couldn't figure out why. She tried to push the thoughts aside and continue with her duties, but the unsettling feeling continued to grow. Every time she passed by his seat, her heart would race a little faster, as if she was waiting for something to happen, something she couldn't predict, something that felt inevitable. She was used to handling all kinds of passengers and was proud of her ability to manage difficult situations, but something about him felt different. Something about this particular passenger unnerved her. She had seen all sorts of behaviors in her years of working as a flight attendant, but never one like this. His silence was suffocating, and his calmness wasn't comforting. It felt like an ominous stillness, like a storm about to break. She tried to focus on the other passengers, but her attention kept drifting back to him each time she walked past his seat. She could feel his presence like a weight in the air. He didn't even look at her as she passed. He just sat there, staring out the window, completely unbothered by the world around him. Yet somehow she felt like he was watching her, watching everything, everyone on the plane. The more she tried to ignore him, the more she felt his eyes on her. It was as if he could see right through her. His silence had a sharpness to it, an intensity she couldn't shake. And as the minutes stretched on the air in the cabin felt heavier, she tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Maybe it was the stress of the flight or the long hours, but deep down she knew something was off about him. She just couldn't put her finger on it, she told herself. It was just another quiet traveler, that nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But the more she told herself that, the less she believed it. As the flight continued, she began to notice small details that only fueled her unease. His clothes were simple, nothing remarkable, but there was an oddness to them, a precision in the way he wore them, like he had chosen them for some specific reason. She hadn't seen him touch his drink or his snack earlier, as if he didn't need anything at all. It was a small thing, but it stuck with her, the kind of thing you couldn't ignore when everything else felt wrong. And the way he kept his sunglasses on, even though the cabin lights were on, felt strange. She had never seen anyone so insistent on hiding their eyes on a flight. It made her wonder what was behind them, what he was trying to conceal. She couldn't stop thinking about him even as she continued her rounds, passing out drinks and checking on the other passengers. Her mind kept drifting back to the man by the window each time she walked past him. She couldn't help but glance at him again, and each time he remained the same, still silent, unmoving. The feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger with every passing minute. She felt like she was on the edge of discovering something huge, something that was just beneath the surface waiting to come to light. As the plane flew on, she began to feel the weight of his gaze pressing on her back, like a hand on her shoulder. Even when he wasn't looking at her directly, she could feel it. He was studying her. He was waiting for something. And she had no idea what that something was, but she was certain it wasn't going to be good. She tried to stay calm. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but nothing like this. This felt different. This felt dangerous. The plane began its slow descent as the captain made the announcement that they were preparing to land. The moment the seatbelt sign flickered on the entire cabin shifted in anticipation. But even as the plane began to tilt downward and the excitement of landing filled the air, the quiet man by the window didn't move. He didn't shift in his seat or even glance around. He simply sat there staring outside. And in that moment, it hit her with a sudden clarity. He wasn't just detached from the rest of the passengers. He was detached from everything, as if the flight itself was nothing more than a fleeting moment to him, something temporary, something that didn't matter to him at all. About halfway through the flight, something unusual happened. The man suddenly adjusted his seat and put his tray table down. She walked by expecting nothing but another polite but unremarkable passenger. But this time he turned his head just enough for their eyes to meet. His gaze was cold, and calculating it sent a chill down her spine. She froze for a split second, unsure of what to do. His eyes never wavered. They seemed to pierce through her, and in that brief moment, she felt like he knew everything about her. He knew more than just the details of her uniform or the flight's schedule. It was as though he could see into her very soul. She quickly looked away and forced a smile, trying to shake off the feeling that had suddenly overtaken her. But it lingered like a shadow that wouldn't leave, no matter how hard she tried to push it aside. She continued down the aisle, doing her best to focus on the other passengers, but her mind kept returning to that brief moment. When their eyes locked, she couldn't stop thinking about how unnervingly still he was, how every movement he made felt deliberate, as if he was in control of everything around him. The quiet man had a presence that couldn't be ignored, and as much as she tried to tell herself he was just another passenger, her gut told her otherwise. There was something about him that didn't belong on this plane, something out of place, but she couldn't figure out what it was. As she went through the rest of her duties, handing out drinks and checking in on other passengers, she kept her distance from him. She tried to avoid looking his way, but each time she passed him, she could feel his eyes on her. Even when he didn't move, when he didn't acknowledge her, it felt as though he was still watching her, carefully studying her reactions, waiting for her to make a mistake or show some sign of weakness. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling was growing stronger that she was in the presence of someone who wasn't just a passive traveler, someone who had an agenda. But what that agenda was, she couldn't begin to guess. The flight continued, and the tension in the cabin began to rise as the hours ticked by. The small noises of air travel became more pronounced, the creaking of the overhead compartments, the hum of the engines, the whispers of passengers speaking softly to one another. The usual buzz of activity had somehow disappeared in the presence of the man by the window. It was as if he had sucked the energy out of the air around him, and in its place was an oppressive silence that seemed to follow his every move. She couldn't escape it, no matter where she went on the plane, no matter how many other passengers she checked on. His presence was like a constant weight on her chest. As the plane cruised over the open sky, she felt an uneasy tremor in the pit of her stomach. It was more than just the strange behavior of the passenger. It was something deeper, something primal, that she couldn't ignore. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she passed him again. She took a deep breath and forced herself to keep moving, but before she could take another step, she heard at the sound of his voice. It was low and smooth, almost too calm to be real. "You don't have to worry about me." He said his words deliberate, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. "I'm not going to cause any trouble." The air seemed to thicken around her. The moment he spoke the words felt like a warning, but it was the way he said them that unsettled her. It wasn't reassuring, it wasn't comforting. It was like he was playing some kind of game with her, one that she wasn't sure she could win. Her heart raced as she turned to face him. Her mind scrambled to process what had just happened. He had spoken to her for the first time, and yet his words felt empty, as if they carried no meaning at all. But the way he looked at her made her think otherwise. He was waiting for something. He was waiting for her to react, and she wasn't sure what would happen if she did. It wasn't until later, when turbulence hit, that the situation took a dark turn. The plane shook violently, passengers screamed, and the flight attendant was thrown into chaos. She rushed down the aisle to calm the terrified passengers, the usual routine. But this time her mind wasn't focused on the usual protocol. It was on the man by the window. She glanced over to see if he was okay, but he hadn't moved a muscle, not even as the plane rattled and swayed. His hands were still resting on his lap, his gaze still fixed on the window, as if the turbulence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His calmness in the midst of the chaos felt wrong. It was like he was detached from the entire situation, like nothing mattered to him. She had seen many passengers react to turbulence, some terrified, some trying to sleep, but none had the unshakable stillness of this man. Her heart beat faster as she moved down the aisle, helping a mother comfort her crying child, and then a businessman who had a death grip on his seat. But she couldn't stop glancing back at him. His unblinking stare through the window was hypnotic, unsettling, like he was waiting for something or someone to happen. And then she saw it, a small shift in his posture, just barely perceptible. His shoulders moved as if he was adjusting his position, but it wasn't his body that had her heart racing. It was his hand resting on the armrest. It had begun to twitch in the slightest way, his fingers dancing as if in anticipation of something yet to come. The plane shook again, a bit harder this time. A loud rumble reverberated through the cabin, sending another wave of fear through the passengers. But the man still didn't move, still didn't react. It was like the turbulence had no power over him, like he was already in control of the situation. In some way she couldn't understand. The unease that had been growing since she first noticed him was now a full-blown knot in her stomach. She had a feeling something was about to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. As the turbulence settled and the plane smoothed out, she made her way back down the aisle. But when she passed his seat again, something strange happened. He turned his head just enough to make brief eye contact with her. His gaze was different this time, sharper, colder, as if he knew something she didn't. And he didn't have to say a word. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing on her. The air between them felt heavy and thick. She tried to push the feeling down, but it refused to go away. It was like a whisper in the back of her mind, telling her to be careful. And then he spoke again. This time his voice was low, but it carried through the hum of the plane, his words cutting through the air with a calm precision. "You should be careful." He said the words simple, but laden with something else, something dark. She froze, her body tensing, her breath catching in her throat. She felt like a deer caught in headlights, unsure whether to respond, unsure whether to run. But she stood there frozen as his words echoed in her mind. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're in danger," he added, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the meaning behind the words was clear. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her pulse. But the fear had already taken root. His gaze didn't waver. It was unblinking, unrelenting. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat felt dry, her mind was racing. And in that moment, she realized she had been wrong about him. He wasn't just a quiet passenger. He wasn't just a man lost in his own thoughts. He was someone with purpose, someone who had been waiting for something, someone who knew exactly what was happening on this flight, and it terrified her. The flight attendant forced herself to turn away, to keep moving down the aisle, but the words followed her. The chill of his warning clung to her skin. She tried to dismiss it, to tell herself it was just paranoia, but deep down she knew it wasn't the man by the window, wasn't just another traveler. He was something far more dangerous. And she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was about to take a turn she wouldn't be able to control. As the turbulence subsided, the man remained eerily still in his seat, his eyes still fixed on the window, like he was watching something far beyond the clouds outside, something only he could see. The flight attendant's heart was pounding in her chest. She tried to shake off his words, the warning that had sent a cold wave through her body, but they clung to her mind like a dark shadow. She couldn't escape. The whole cabin seemed quieter now, as if everyone else had fallen into a strange calmness except for her and the quiet man by the window. She couldn't focus on her tasks anymore. Her mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he spoke, as if he knew something that no one else did, as if he knew what was going to happen next. She glanced down the aisle as the plane began to level off. The usual chatter and movement from the other passengers had returned, but it felt distant, it felt muffled, like she was underwater. Her eyes darted to the man once more, but this time he wasn't just sitting there. He had shifted in his seat and was looking directly at her, his dark sunglasses still in place. But she could feel his eyes behind them, staring right through her. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. It was as if an invisible force was pulling her toward him, drawing her in against her will. "You've been warned." His voice cut through the silence again. The calmness in his tone made her skin crawl. It was so collected, so sure of itself, that it felt like a command rather than a warning. The words hung in the air, between them like a threat left unspoken. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure, but her mind was racing. What did he mean by that? What was he trying to tell her? Was this just a strange encounter with an eccentric passenger, or was something more sinister unfolding around her? The rest of the flight was uneventful, but her nerves were shot. The normal rhythms of cabin service felt like they were happening in slow motion. Her hands shook as she passed by the rows of seats, her eyes always darting back to the man by the window who had returned to his unnerving stillness. She couldn't focus on anything else, no matter how hard she tried. Every time she walked past him, his presence was like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. It was as if the entire plane had become a stage, and she was the only one who wasn't sure of the script. As the flight drew closer to its destination, the man remained motionless, never once breaking his gaze from the window. It was like he wasn't part of this world at all, like he was suspended between reality and something else altogether. She tried to tell herself it was just nerves, that it was the stress of the job and the constant demands of keeping passengers calm. But deep down she knew something else was at play, something much darker than just her imagination. The captain made the announcement that they were beginning to prepare for landing, and the usual stir of activity filled the cabin. People unbuckled their seatbelts, gathered their belongings. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, checking that everyone was ready. But as she passed by the man once more, she saw something that made her blood run cold. His fingers were no longer resting on the armrest. They were moving. They were tapping out a slow, rhythmic pattern on the seat back in front of him, almost like a code. The tapping was soft but deliberate, and it made her stomach turn. There was something hypnotic about it, something mechanical, like he wasn't really here at all, but somewhere else, a place she didn't want to imagine. She paused for a moment, staring at his hand as it moved steadily, tapping once, twice, 3 times in perfect rhythm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. He sat back in his seat, his fingers still, his eyes still hidden behind those dark glasses. But somehow she knew that the tapping wasn't just a nervous habit. It was a signal of some kind, a warning or a message. And now that she had noticed it, she couldn't unsee it, she couldn't unhear it. The plane was descending now closer to the ground. The passengers were getting ready to disembark. But for the flight attendant, the ground felt miles away, like she was still up in the air, suspended with the quiet man by the window, and the creeping sense that something was about to happen that she wasn't prepared for, not in the slightest. The plane was descending rapidly. Now the cabin was buzzing with excitement, the hum of the engines growing louder as they neared the airport. But for the flight attendant, everything seemed to slow down. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the entire flight had been building to this moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everything about the quiet man by the window was off. His presence was a constant weight on her mind, like an invisible hand pressing down on her shoulders. His strange behavior had left her on edge, and now that they were nearing the ground, she felt a sudden surge of dread. She didn't know why, but she had an overwhelming sense that once the plane touched down, nothing would be the same. As the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were minutes from landing, the flight attendant took a deep breath. Trying to steady her nerves, she moved through the aisles, making final checks on seat belts and tray tables. But her attention kept straying back to the man. His silence was suffocating. His stillness was unnerving. The tapping of his fingers was still in her mind, echoing through her thoughts like a haunting melody. She tried to shake it off, but it stuck with her. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for the moment to arrive. But what moment? She couldn't figure it out. She just knew something was coming. The passengers around her were oblivious to the tension in the air. Most of them were busy talking or looking out the windows in anticipation of the landing. But the flight attendant couldn't focus on anything else except the man by the window, his dark glasses hiding his eyes. But she could still feel his gaze on her every time she passed by his seat. Every time she glanced his way, he seemed to be watching her closely, like he was waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to slip up. Then something happened. Just as the plane began to make its final approach, a strange sound filled the cabin. It was low at first, almost inaudible, but it grew louder, like a distant hum, coming from somewhere deep inside the plane. The passengers started looking around. Confused murmurs spread through the rows, and the flight attendant froze. It wasn't the usual sounds of a plane landing. This was something different. It was a noise she had never heard before, a low, eerie vibration that seemed to be coming from the very walls of the aircraft. She glanced over at the man and saw that his fingers were moving again, tapping faster this time, with a sense of urgency. But the rest of him remained as still as ever, his face hidden behind his sunglasses. But his movements had taken on a different rhythm now, like he was orchestrating something. The plane shook lightly as it continued its descent, and the hum grew louder still. It was almost as if the plane itself was reacting to whatever was happening inside it. The flight attendant's heart was racing, her breath quickening. As the atmosphere in the cabin shifted, she felt a growing sense of panic starting to spread through the passengers. Some were looking around in confusion. Others were nervously clutching their armrests. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't explain it. The sensation in the air was palpable, like everyone was on the edge of something about to happen. And then she heard it, a voice, the voice of the captain, crackling over the intercom. It was brief, but chilling. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing some technical difficulties." The message was calm, but there was an undertone of urgency in his voice, and just as he finished speaking, the hum reached its peak and then stopped suddenly. The entire plane fell into an unnatural silence. The quiet man by the window was still tapping his fingers, but now the rhythm had changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate and fast-paced, almost like a countdown. The flight attendant's stomach twisted as she realized what he was doing, and in that moment it hit her. This wasn't just some strange passenger. This was someone who knew exactly what was going to happen, and he was preparing for it, preparing for something that none of them had any idea was coming. The tapping continued, his fingers moving with precision, as if he was counting down to an inevitable moment. The silence in the cabin was deafening now. The only sound was the low hum of the engines and the rhythmic tapping from the man's seat. His fingers never stopped. The tension in the air was so thick that it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something that she could feel was about to happen, but had no way of stopping. The plane was nearing the runway now. The wheels could be heard touching down, but something was off. The usual thud of landing wasn't there. Instead, the plane felt like it was gliding too smoothly, too silently, as if the ground itself was resisting the plane's descent. The passengers shifted in their seats, but the flight attendant couldn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off the man by the window. His tapping had stopped suddenly, but the tension in the air only grew stronger, like something had been set in motion, something terrible that no one could undo. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing added up, nothing made sense. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, and it felt like the world outside the plane had disappeared. The only thing left was her, the passengers, and the quiet man. As the plane touched down, she braced herself for the usual bump and jolt, but instead it was a soft landing, too soft, almost as if the plane wasn't touching the runway at all. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat. The strange hum from earlier had returned, and it seemed louder now, louder than ever. It vibrated through the walls of the plane, and then the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. A few passengers screamed, others gasped, but the flight attendant couldn't move. She couldn't do anything. Her mind was spinning. She had to get control of the situation, but she didn't know what was happening. Nothing was following the normal course. Nothing was the way it was supposed to be. She felt the vibrations beneath her feet again. This time they were stronger, a rhythmic pulse, like something inside the plane was alive, like the plane itself was breathing. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the quiet man's seat. It was coming from everywhere, from all sides. It was everywhere around her, a low thumping sound that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. The flight attendant stumbled back, trying to make sense of the noise, but there was no escaping it. It was all around her, and it was getting closer, getting louder. Her heart was racing as her breathing quickened. The passengers around her were panicking now. Some were screaming, some were praying, but there was nothing she could do, nothing that made sense in this moment. All the training in the world couldn't help her now. She was trapped inside this nightmare with no idea of what was really going on. She heard the captain's voice crackling through the intercom, but it wasn't calm anymore. It was frantic, almost desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing an emergency situation. I repeat, an emergency situation. Please stay calm." The message repeated over and over, but the words didn't make it better. They only made everything feel worse. The vibrations continued. The hum got louder, and then she heard something she wasn't prepared for: the sound of metal grinding against metal, a sharp screech that cut through the air like a knife. The passengers screamed in terror, and the flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the panic spreading like wildfire through the cabin. And then the plane jerked hard, sending everyone flying forward. For a brief, terrifying moment, it felt like they were weightless, like they were suspended in midair. The force of it was so strong that her body slammed into the aisle. She cried out in pain. But before she could recover, she heard the quiet man's voice again. Only this time it wasn't calm, it wasn't collected, it was filled with something else, something darker. "It's too late," he said, his voice low and hollow. "You should have listened." And before she could respond, the sound of the plane tearing apart filled the air. The walls groaned as if they were buckling under an immense pressure. And then there was a deafening crash, and the lights went out completely. In the pitch-black silence that followed, the flight attendant could hear nothing but the frantic breaths of the passengers. The plane was no longer on solid ground. It was falling towards something dark and endless. She didn't know how much time had passed, how far they had fallen. She didn't know if they were going to survive, or if the nightmare was just beginning. But one thing was clear: the quiet man by the window had known this would happen. He had known the moment of their doom, and had waited patiently for it to arrive all along, and now it was too late.